Hi, I'm Georgia, and I live in LA, and this is my walk away video. So I have voted Democrat my entire life, but I walked away in about December of 2018. And it was hard for me to make this video because I know kind of how people feel about conservatives, especially if they're Trump voters. And, I didn't really want to think that people would be feeling that way about me. But that's actually why I think it's really important to make this video. When I kind of busted out of the Democrat echo chamber, that's when I realized like how warped and inaccurate my whole perception of conservatives was. And I want to kind of make this video to help explain to some people like the things that I didn't understand maybe in 2016. So I was born and raised in Massachusetts in like a pretty progressive community or in a pretty progressive environment. And like a lot of people who grow up in like blue states, I was raised basically to be a Democrat. So, from a young age, I was kind of taught this story about American politics. And the story kind of goes, Democrats are the good guys. They are looking out for the little guy. And Republicans are the bad guys. They are for the rich. They maybe like exploit. They're bigots. In the case of women, it's like they want to control your body, etc. And this whole story is very emotionally resonant, especially for like a teenager when you kind of learn it, because it kind of taps into that idea of like good versus evil, and you want to kind of be on the side of good. And if I'm really honest, probably the only issue that I even leaned left on really growing up was gay marriage. And in Massachusetts in the early 2000s, this was kind of like a hot button issue for us. And I had gay friends at school. And so for me, like I was totally pro gay marriage. And so that was basically the thing that made me decide that I was going to be a Democrat. And I didn't really, to be honest, know too much else about the platform. Even from the start, and certainly during like my early years in adulthood, there were kind of cracks in this story and things that made me have my doubts. And my whole walkaway story is basically like the story of me ignoring those clues, ignoring the cracks, and just like putting them aside until I kind of reached this point in 2018 that I couldn't anymore. It was too much. It's almost embarrassing to kind of tell you about like all the things that I ignored. But that's kind of the story of this whole walkaway thing, is like all those things that we ignored until we couldn't ignore them anymore. And that was kind of what happened to me. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. When I was 22, I graduated college and I joined this program called Teach for America. So I've always been very passionate about educational equality, and this program was basically a program that trains teachers and puts them in low-income schools to help turn those schools around. And what I didn't know at that time was that Teach for America, or TFA, was kind of becoming like a very woke organization. So like in 2020, you probably kind of know what I mean when I say woke. So for example, we would have a lot of group discussions about like oppressor and oppressed. And that's where I first learned words like microaggression and systemic racism, that kind of thing. And this was my first job, and I was very impressed with my peers, and I really wanted to fit in. And I was definitely like very on board with this whole goal of, helping these schools and helping these kids in these neighborhoods. But very early on, I was bothered and uncomfortable with the way the sort of higher ups in this organization were framing our conversations around race. It felt unhealthy. So I really didn't like how I felt like we were being coached to like take offense at a lot of little things and to kind of like sniff out racism, in our peers or in other people. And I really didn't think it was healthy the way my Black peers were kind of, coached to or pushed to kind of dredge up like generational grievances and, interpret sort of benign interactions as like microaggressions. I mean, I can't really think of anything more sort of psychologically abusive than like training people to sort of live in a state of resentment. And I kind of felt like this organization was kind of pushing that on my Black peers. And, of course, if you're white like me, you kind of just like become accustomed to, everyone kind of just like dumps on your race all the time. And, it's, of course, it's like irritating and like not constructive at all, but you kind of like are trained to think that there's something sort of valuable or moral about doing that. And kind of all of this felt to me sort of alien and kind of backwards from the morality I had been raised with, that I thought we'd all been raised with, where you're like supposed to judge people by the content of their character, or like basically like anything except the color of their skin. And sometimes people would say like, hey, like this, shouldn't we be, doing what Martin Luther King said, like judging people by the content of their character? And like, that was one of the wrong opinions. So there were right opinions and there were wrong opinions. And that was one of the ones that you have to learn is a wrong opinion. It would kind of be told something like, in order to like honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, we need to kind of go beyond his prescription of focusing on character, and we need to kind of dig in and really understand how race, informs all aspects of American culture or American institutions. So these things were kind of explained with kind of academic speak that sort of had a patina of plausibility, especially for like a 22-year-old who didn't have any life experience. And I mean, certainly there were kind of nuggets of wisdom that were in there that would kind of like draw you in. And certainly like as a white person, this ideology sort of like breaks you down and kind of breaks down your own sort of trust in your own moral compass, because people are kind of telling you, your opinions aren't really as valid as someone else's because you don't have like the correct like lived experience to fully understand the situation. So needless to say, there was a lot of crying and stress and unhappiness involved with this organization. And as an adult, I look back on that and I'm like, those are clear signs of a toxic work culture. But back then I was naive, we were basically told that our discomfort was like part of the process, or like our discomfort was us clinging to our privilege, or it was like our white fragility. They had all these kind of terms that functioned to normalize the very toxic cognitive dissonance that we were experiencing. And sort of they had all this language that served to kind of make us feel shame and doubt about our doubts, made us feel bad for even like having questions about the things that we were being told. There were also a fair amount of like no-go topics. So for example, you couldn't ever mention anything about how like culture might affect academic performance. So because that would be considered like blaming the victim. So like never mention Asian students, for example, none of that. Another no-go topic was you should not reference any sort of or affirm any sort of generational progress. So, for example, people would get really ruffled if you were to kind of suggest that like maybe racism doesn't play as large a role in our school failures today as like 50 years ago. Like that was like a no-go. And this kind of intellectual gatekeeping was really a red flag for me. Pretty early on, this was something that really got to me, because my feeling is, this is not how you approach a problem when you really want to solve the problem. So the thing that really snapped me out of this whole SJW thing, and frankly, I'm not really sure that I was ever in it, but the thing that really like solidified for me that I did not want to be a part of this way of thinking was my students. So I loved my students, and I had this extremely strong gut instinct that I do not want them exposed to this kind of ideology. This is not going to be good for them. I do not want them entering the world feeling like they are victims. I wanted them to feel like they had this totally bright future, and that, you know, if they just work hard, you know, that it is totally possible for them. And it's not that I did not acknowledge the injustice. I mean, I was massively stressed about sort of the injustice that my kids faced, you know, by dint of attending this like school system that was, you know, totally inferior to the one, say, that like I had attended. But what I didn't want was for them to internalize that as, you know, a reason to give up. So I was very cognizant sort of from the beginning and throughout of like always being a cheerleader, always be a cheerleader. When I was growing up, I had, you know, one of my older cousins. She was always like my biggest cheerleader. And when I was with her, I felt like I could do anything, I could be anything. And so that was sort of the sort of guiding North Star that I kept throughout this program, is like, that's who I want to be for my students. And this whole like victim mentality, like that has no place in our classroom, in our relationship, you know, or in my kids' heads, frankly, at all. At that time, I didn't comprehend that this was like at all a political stance. And I certainly didn't comprehend that my instinct in this regard was like deeply conservative. You know, as far as I knew, as far as I was taught, you know, conservatives don't give a damn about my kids. You know, they only care about themselves. They only care about, you know, shareholders or whatever. So it never crossed my mind that like I might like be one of these dreaded conservatives. But the experience did wake me up to the destructiveness of identity politics. And it did kind of clue me in that this was kind of like a creature of the left, this whole identity politics thing. Although it was much, like in the mainstream, it was much less than it is today. And it also taught me the super valuable lesson that a lot of people who claim to be fighting racism like are like absolutely doing nothing of the sort. And basically at this point, like the louder the person is about fighting racism, like the more suspicious I am of their ability to do that in any way. Being part of sort of like a social justice organization brought me into contact with a fair amount of people like that. And it taught me that there is a certain type of person who makes like fighting racism sort of a part of their identity. And the problem with that is, you know, as noble as it sounds, the problem with that is if, you know, the existence of a problem is part of a person's identity, they become very threatened by the idea of like that problem being resolved. And they may even engage in like sabotage behaviors, which frankly, I think a lot of this woke ideology is a sabotage effort. And I mean, that's why you see some of these people kind of desperately trying to expand the definition of racism so that like there's always going to be a sufficient amount of it that they can like continue wallowing in their like heroic identity. And there's a very clear distinction between those people and like the real deal, like Martin Luther King, because someone like Martin Luther King actually had a vision for a time in the future where this problem wouldn't be there. Like his goal, his future, his vision was a vision for the future where he did not need to have this problem. And that is distinctly different from the crew of people I think we see today more than ever, of people who don't really want to move past this problem because they have a lot of like personal investment in the problem. All right, so I also saw pretty quick that a lot of this progressive ideology had percolated through the school system, like from kind of the Department of Education level. And we had all these kind of policies at our district that were theoretically designed to kind of help the most vulnerable students and kind of give them a boost. And of course, that sounds great in theory, but in practice, like they were a complete disaster. So for example, it was like nearly impossible to give a student a failing grade. It was really difficult to give like a disciplinary consequence for really egregious behavior. I mean, we had kids, if they got expelled, the district would like overturn it a few days later and they'd be back in the school. So the standards for graduation basically were just dirt low. It basically created this situation for the 90% of kids who want to learn, who are doing the right thing, where they're not able to learn because we were kind of forced to coddle and bend the rules for this lowest performing 10%. And it was spoiling the opportunities for the other 90%. It was a joke, and kids would kind of learn like, wow, school is a joke. You would think, with how spectacularly bad the test scores were, and with like the basically zoo-like chaos in the hallways, and just like catastrophic failure year after year, you'd think that like the Department of Education would maybe rethink some of their policies, question them, but like no, they never do. What they do is they just kind of double down on more of the same. More of these compassionate policies that just like spiral our standards. I mean, it's like we are chasing our standards down a swirling toilet at this point in the Department of Education. And it was during that time when I worked in education that I became really uncomfortable with the sort of patronizing attitude that I sensed from the political left towards minority students or minority people in general. I was kind of developing a very deep sense that a lot of these policies, these compassionate policies, were kind of undergirded with this deep belief that, some people, specifically like Black people, are not really capable of meeting the same standards that white people are. You need to like give them accommodations so that we can like even the playing field, which is frankly like, it's just like a PC, like sort of friendly way of saying like, oh, go easy on them, because they're not like us. And I remember seeing like a quote from George W. Bush about the soft bigotry of low expectations. And I remember thinking like, being like kind of surprised and confused that like a Republican said that, because, I always thought of like Republicans don't care about racism. They're maybe racist themselves. And like Democrats are the ones who care about racism. But here was like this Republican president who was like speaking exactly my mind about the sort of nature of racism in America today. Anyway, there is so much more wrong with the school system, and actually it's kind of a microcosm for how the problems with the left in general, but I'm just going to give you like maybe 2 more examples. So this is going to blow your mind. The Department of Education is, when I say it is like a bloated disaster of a bureaucracy, let me just explain. Like for every one teacher that was hired in my district for Memphis City Schools, which was like there were thousands of teachers, there were 2 administrators hired. And virtually all of them worked sort of at the central office, which was basically like the size of a small shopping mall. It was huge. So more than half of our budget to like do things for the Department of Education was going towards adults who like did not even work in the schools. And so for perspective, like, I never had a class with less than 30 students. My second year, I had a special needs class with 37 kids. We didn't even have school buses to transport our school sports teams to their events. We had to have parents and teachers drive them. We were operating on a shoestring, and more than half of our funds were going to, I assume, this central office. And, I knew on some level that like big government bureaucracy, that's like sort of more of a left-wing thing. But to be honest, like it was just like another thing. It was just another thing that I put in a box that I put away that I just didn't think about, because I just legitimately thought that Democrats were the only acceptable option if you're not just like a horrible person. Meanwhile, I had colleagues who worked at charter schools. And so if you don't know, charter schools are kind of like, they're also free, they're public, but they are sort of less connected to the Department of Education. They're more independent. Anyway, so they receive less funding per student, but my colleagues were making like $15,000 more per year than me as a teacher. And they had like 20 kids in a class, and their kids were succeeding. I observed some of their classes, and it was like night and day when you compare the public school to the charter schools. Even back then, I knew that charter schools were kind of like political, but I didn't fully understand the true details of that. I knew on some level that conservatives were pro-charter, they wanted to expand charters, expand school choice, and I knew that I knew that the teachers union was against charters and that the Democrats were largely funded by the teachers union. But to be honest, like, this was like during the Obama years, and I just looked at President Obama. I thought he was so impressive, so articulate, whatever. I just kind of like trusted that the Democrats had their reasons for doing things that they do. And so, even though it seemed crazy to me, I trusted the brand. I trusted the Democrat brand to do the right thing for my kids. And what a lot of people don't realize now, a lot of people in a few weeks from now are going to go to the polls, they're going to vote for Joe Biden, and they're not going to know that they're voting to shut down charter schools in minority neighborhoods. They just don't know. Okay, so enough about schools. I kind of want to talk about the media, because another part of like my change of heart was when I learned like how corrupt our media is. So in around 2013, I remember there was this kind of media trend where we would see like a short video of a white teacher in some sort of altercation with a black student, or like a white school resource officer, yanking someone out of their desk or whatever. And it would be like this big sensational thing. And we would have like all these articles about, the systemic racism that like supposedly pervades our schools. And like, I immediately knew, I was like, I had just come from a school district where, a teacher could get pushed down the stairs by a student, fully down a flight of stairs. They could break a bone, whatever, and the student would barely get a consequence. So I knew that this whole tale they were trying to spin, I knew that this was not really reflective of reality. And I felt bad for these teachers that were kind of being slandered as racist, like purely based on the color of their skin. I also kind of learned from observing this little trend how the media lies. So they lie without specifically telling you lies. They sort of lie by cherry picking stories, and then they crop the videos, and then they omit certain important details, and then they kind of squash other kinds of stories. So it kind of creates this effect of like seeing this like trend that in real life like does not exist. So it was kind of like deja vu when Ferguson happened and like BLM kind of sprung up. And I'll be honest, I was immediately skeptical of the Michael Brown story. So I waited for the DOJ report to come out, and I read it, and I saw, yeah, like we were lied to, like massively lied to. If you haven't read it, you should. And this was the first time that I really saw sort of the sinister side of what the media is doing. So with the teacher thing, that like kind of irked me. But with the BLM thing, this time we were seeing like a majority Black community be basically burnt to the ground in the name of racial justice. And it was all kind of spawned by a media story that was a lie, like a full cloth lie. And that's when I also started seeing how the Democrat Party kind of was pandering to Black voters sort of while capitalizing on their fear. That was the first time that I really got angry at the Democrats and at the media, because I felt like, I see what you're doing to Black Americans, and it's not okay. It's like you act like you're on their side, like blah, blah, blah about racism, but you're not on their side. You're trying to make them afraid because you think you have something to gain from them being afraid. That's cruel. That's cruel. You're a bully. I mean, it's like you're the exact thing that you're claiming to be fighting against. I actually disaffiliated from the Democrats around the time that Hillary made that comment about like hot sauce in my purse. That was like disgusting to me. That was when I first kind of caught the scent that the Democrat Party not only like wasn't the friend of Black Americans, like they were actively harming them. Kind of sort of going out of their way to generate fear, and then to turn around and say, oh, but don't worry, like we'll protect you. And, see, I'm your friend. I have this hot sauce in my purse. Like it was so cheap, and like I could see straight through it. It was so cheap, and it was gross. But for whatever reason, well, I know because I was brainwashed, I continued to believe everything else that they said, that the media said, that the Democrats said about President Trump. Because I had this like kind of script in my mind that, you know, Republicans are bigots, they're for the rich, blah, blah, blah. And so I was kind of like lulled by, you know, reporting that sort of confirmed that idea that I had. So around 2017, 2018, I also started noticing kind of another troubling trend. So the trend I noticed was that news reporters that were reporting on President Trump like hated him. And of course I hated him too, but I was disturbed to see all this kind of gratuitous editorializing in their reporting. You know, I have some old school reporters in my family, and I had sort of heard in passing once when I was younger that you should never be able to tell how a reporter votes from the way they cover a topic. That's how you know, that's just part of journalistic ethics. And so I became a little bit suspicious and just concerned about the ability of these reporters to really give me the facts in like a straight manner. And so this is really nuts. So at that time, I got most of my news just like from the Apple News app, and I didn't curate too rigorously which sources it was. Mostly, you know, mainstream sources, New York Times, whatever. But every once in a while, like an outlet, an article from someplace like Daily Wire or someplace like that would pop into my feed, and I would read it. And I would read it and I would think like, oh my gosh, like, thank God there is some other sane person on this earth. Like, thank you for noticing this. Like, and you know, I would feel like this like spark of intellectual connection with this person. But then I would have this sort of spidey sense that like, you know, I think this might be a conservative outlet, you know, and I would think to myself, like, I don't think my people would want me reading this stuff. So, you know, no more of that, you know, like that was a little treat, but like, I can't make a habit of it. And it's so insane to admit, but like, that was kind of how I thought about it. And it really goes to show like how strong the thought policing is among the left, that like you worry about what people think about just your thoughts. I also noticed this fairly concerning trend of like where things that Trump said that seemed crazy would turn out to be true. So for example, when he said that Obama wiretapped his campaign offices, of course, everyone said it was crazy and whatever. And I thought he was just like speaking off the cuff saying crazy things. But then, oh, lo and behold, you know, months later, evidence starts bubbling up that like they did in fact listen in on his phones and during his campaign. And so like I noticed that, you know, CNN, when this came out, it's like they issue like sort of a terse little paragraph that's like, you know, there was some, you know, surveillance during the Trump campaign at Trump Tower, but it was like all above board. And like, you know, it's not even necessarily a confirmed account. So like Trump could still be lying about this, and like, you know, moving on, nothing to see here, folks. And like the story would die. Like it would be up for like a day, and then like it would be gone. And like a similar thing would happen when it comes to like controversial Trump quotes. So I remember there were so many times that I would see like a whole flurry of articles come up about some really offensive quote that Trump said. And so I would go and I would listen to the quote or look at the quote, and I would see it and I would think like maybe I'm crazy, but like this isn't like that racist. It's more just like a foot in mouth. Like it's like off-putting, but like I don't know if this like indicates like genocidal tendencies, like by any stretch of the imagination, you know? Like it kind of sounded like this is a guy from Queens kind of talking like a guy from Queens, and like how does anyone not immediately see that? And I started getting annoyed that like, you know, with like the phony pearl clutching over like every little thing that he said. I mean, I still assumed that he was racist, of course, that's what they told me, but I was kind of wondering like why the media was like wasting all their time on these like kind of weak examples. Like if, you know, bring us some strong examples. Like why would you need to waste your time with this? So probably the thing that bothered me the most was sort of the broad and rampant and like totally unapologetic disparagement of Trump's voters. I was most sort of shook to see like friends and family and people I knew to be like good and decent kind of writing off Trump voters as like deplorable. 63 million Americans, like racist, transphobic, deplorable. And I heard that come out of the mouth of people who I like knew to be like kind and gentle people. And I just was thinking like, you wouldn't have said that on your own. Like the TV must have taught you that, because that's not who you are. And that was kind of where I started really putting together like how divisive our media is, because like in the way that it's able to brainwash like good, decent people into hating their neighbors, into just blindly disparaging huge swaths of, their of this population, brainwashing them into thinking it's like praiseworthy even to demonstrate contempt for like millions of Americans that they've never met. So I've spoken about how Democrats kind of fearmonger to Black Americans, but I haven't yet mentioned how I kind of began to realize how they fearmonger to women. So for years, I was kind of conditioned to think that like, every election is a potential attack on Roe v. Wade, which is de facto an attack on women. So in 2017, I graduated nursing school, and I became an emergency department nurse. So I won't go into any gruesome details, and I don't want to get sanctimonious on the concept, but suffice it to say, my experiences as a nurse made me feel really differently about abortion. As an ER nurse, I see miscarriage up close. So for example, like if, when miscarriage happens in the ER, it's the nurse who is there with the woman, and we take away the body. So that's something I'm exposed to, and it's something, it's part of my work. I think it was probably the day that I saw a woman miscarry at 20 weeks, that I kind of reached a turning point. And I remember walking down the hall in the hospital and thinking to myself, I'm ready to let go of my attachment to this abortion issue. I don't have any fight left in me for this. It kind of clicked in my mind that, conservatives aren't trying to control my body. That message was kind of running as like a background script in my mind because I had been given that message so young, but sort of this experience kind of made me kind of become conscious of it. And when I became conscious of it, I realized how absurd that whole idea is. And I look back on that moment as kind of the moment I opened my mind. It's not like I became suddenly overnight pro-life, but that was the moment I kind of lost my fear. I no longer felt attacked, and I kind of got this new emotional distance from politics that allowed me to kind of see things from sort of a cooler head. And to be honest, it kind of knocked me off my moral high horse a little bit, because it made me realize oh wow, some things I thought maybe were obvious or I was taught were obvious, maybe I was wrong. And what else am I wrong about? If I was wrong about that, what else was I wrong about? As an ER nurse, I also see, similar to when I was a teacher, I also see a lot of the nitty gritty of reality that I think some of my progressive affluent peers maybe don't see. Working in the ER, I was again seeing a lot of these kind of woke progressive policies that are compassionate, but in practice, they are kind of a disaster. So for example, I saw the ways in which the hospital system is abused. People come in for drugs, they come in for things that they should get elsewhere, but it's free, so whatever. Or for homeless people, they come in for a place to sleep. And those kind of inappropriate uses of the healthcare system are driving up the costs for all the regular people, the people who are paying into it. And at that time, I was working in an area that, in a hospital that served a lot of homeless people. And that's a big issue here in LA because it's kind of a ballooning out of control, this homeless population. And because of that, because of a lot of the work that I did with homeless people, I kind of saw another sort of iteration of the sort of bottomless standards that progressivism kind of courts into society. So in other societies, I think if a person like drops their pants and takes a crap on the sidewalk, or like, throws an open bottle of urine at a registered nurse, like people would be horrified and they would get a consequence. But, here, especially in California, I mean, if a person sort of checks certain intersectional boxes, like, I mean, they can do whatever and nobody bats an eye. And, us Californians, I feel like we tolerate a lot of really egregious behavior because we want to be compassionate and we feel bad enforcing any kind of consequences on people. But letting that behavior kind of go on and become acceptable really is punishing for the middle class and all the people who are just trying to like raise their families in a clean and safe environment. And frankly, like that's not compassionate. It's not compassionate to them. And, I noticed that sometimes I would kind of vent my frustrations to my family and friends who are basically all progressive. And I felt like, I was sometimes made to feel like an asshole for kind of having these frustrations, like as if there's something like morally degenerate about wanting to champion regular people or like, holding certain victims accountable in any capacity. And it's basically become taboo to ask, like, is this compassionate policy actually compassionate? Is it actually helping anyone? Is it compassionate to decriminalize petty theft? Is that compassionate to our business owners, many of whom like are small businesses? Is it compassionate to allow a tent city to crop up in front of like an immigrant's bodega business? Like, is that compassionate? I started to feel pretty strongly that my kind of like progressive peers had a certain blindness. Like there was a blindness to the way these compassionate policies kind of punish this sort of silent group of law-abiding people. And there's sort of this blindness to the social entropy that, inevitably follows when you give up on enforcing standards, And there's a blindness to the resentment that gets fomented when, regular law-abiding people feel like chumps for following the rules. You can't have a society where people feel like chumps for following the rules. Like why bother following the rules if you live in a society like that? And it's not fair. It's not fair to those people. And it's a recipe for unraveling sort of in a longer term sense. And it was about that time in late 2018, right after the election, that I started hearing about this like beautiful, charismatic, young congresswoman, AOC, who was kind of championing socialism. And she was my same age, but unlike me, her only experience at that time was bartending. So here's this woman who, has never taught a day in the public schools, has never worked a day as a nurse on the front lines in the ER, but she was kind of championing out there with like a bullhorn all these policies that were the same like woke garbage that I have been fighting against my entire career. Keywords being like entire career. And it like I don't want to be overly harsh. Like I actually, I find AOC a little bit likable and impressive even in some ways. But the things that she was saying, like policy-wise, like they were to me as a veteran teacher, as a registered nurse, like they were beyond parody. I mean, like they were just naive beyond parody. But the thing that stunned me was seeing, smart and serious members of the Democratic Party, like taking her seriously. I mean, that blew me away. And that was the first time that I was kind of able to see that like we as a party, Democrats, had become like kind of a vapid laughingstock. And I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed to be a Democrat, and I always thought of the Democrats as like the party of educated people. And I kind of had sort of a pride in that, like that I might be part of that like elite group. But suddenly I was kind of seeing how frivolous and sheltered and hubristic that whole kind of mindset was. Anyways, I kind of had this feeling at that point of like, I don't belong here anymore. I'm a grown woman. I've seen too much, and I have been cleaning up the messes from these progressive politicians like for my whole career, and I'm done with it. And to be honest, I had other things also that were kind of swirling around in my mind at that time. I was livid seeing Democrats, tearing down the legacy of this country, disparaging our founders, disparaging our people, disparaging our values, as if it's like some sort of sign of virtue to like talk shit about your own country, which is really just a way of saying like, all you people suck, but like, I'm different, and I had also like had it up to my ears with like the transgender stuff, the pure insanity of pumping prepubescent children with drugs to arrest their puberty. Like, you don't have, like, I am a nurse. You don't have to be a nurse to be like, hold on, like, what? Red flag. No. I had at this point just felt like the walls of crazy were closing in, and I had just like was out of there like a bat out of hell. And it's funny because even though I was like just red hot angry at the Democrats, I still had my irrational sort of pre-programmed fears of Republicans, from kind of all of those years of brainwashing. And even though I leaned to the right on most issues, I still had this little voice in my head telling me that like, yeah, those people maybe agree with you, but they don't agree with you for the right reasons. Like, you're not one of them. Which is, of course, like such a deranged and like hubristic thought, but that's part of like the Democrat moral universe, is you have to buy into that, that a Republican can have a good idea, but they're not allowed to have that idea for any sort of good reasons. But I did feel like, if I can't vote Democrat, like maybe I should just like listen to what these conservatives have to say, because like, what else am I going to do? Not vote? That is when I went down the rabbit hole. I started listening to kind of like long form interviews with people like Dave Rubin, and eventually I found Ben Shapiro, the dreaded Ben Shapiro. At first, I actually felt really guilty for like listening to conservative ideas, as if there's like something naughty about like listening to wrong-think, which some of you maybe feel bad listening to all my wrong-think. But again, like it just shows you how strong the brainwashing is, that we don't even let ourselves think for ourselves, even though we know we're holding in our thoughts, and we still do it. And on some level, I was also like afraid that I might actually agree with these people, because if I agreed with them, that would kind of mean that now I'm kind of like outside of my tribe, and even if I held my opinions in and I stayed silent around my friends and family, like there's still something really lonely about feeling like even if they don't know it, like I know that I don't fit in anymore. But to be honest, like I had kind of reached a point of no return where I felt like I need to think for myself, and I need oxygen, because I was just like so surrounded by so much crazy for so long that I just was like, I was like starved. I felt like I was starved for actual stuff that makes sense. So I started listening to people like Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro and Larry Elder. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like there are people out there like just like speaking their mind, like speaking totally freely and making sense, and like hallelujah, like I am not alone. I'm not alone, like thinking the way I think. So in the past, my exposure to conservative thought had basically been, like this will sound like a joke, but like basically it was limited to, clips of Sebastian Gorka shouting someone down for 45 seconds on CNN. So now I was kind of listening to these conservative arguments like fully explained in their strongest form. And it was like nothing short of an awakening. Like, I don't use that word lightly. Like, I felt like my whole like left-wing brainwashing and programming I felt like it was falling like a house of cards. And all the things that hadn't made sense, that for years I was like forcing myself to just ignore the fact it didn't make sense. It was like all of a sudden that stuff was falling away, and I didn't have to believe things that I didn't really believe. I only have to believe things that are true, that have evidence. Oh my God, life-changing. Life-changing. And I won't go into all the reasons that I really respect conservatism as like a philosophy, because that would be like a whole other video, or like a whole other like set of tomes. But I will say this, the whole experience of like breaking out of the progressive hive mind, or like the progressive echo chamber, was a pretty profound experience. And it made me realize a few things. First, it made me realize that our mainstream media is garbage. I knew there were some problems. No, like it goes out of the way, not just to not tell you things, but to obscure the truth, to twist the truth, to tell you something that is the opposite of the truth. It is that bad. And the other thing I kind of learned is that same media, if you don't know what it's doing, it controls us on a profound level. I went through years of ignoring clues, because I was sort of washed over with this media that told me the things that I see with my eyes and ears in real life, those aren't real. The stuff on the telly is real. Don't believe your own eyes and ears, like believe the television. And for years I did, and I think of myself as like a good critical thinker, or like someone who thinks for themselves. But, I was duped for years. So at this point in my life, I can proudly say, like, I am a conservative woman. And like, I have no shame now saying that, because now I know what it means to say you're a conservative. And all the reasons that I thought I was a Democrat, after I went through, all these experiences in my life, all those reasons I thought I was a Democrat, being tolerant, caring about fairness, all those reasons I thought I was a Democrat are now the reasons that going forward, I'll be voting Republican. If anyone's still watching this super long video, thanks for watching, and God bless the USA.